Good afternoon. My name is Erica Myers. I'm the lead of Microsoft's Airband US initiative in rural America. That's the area that I focus on. I'm excited to bring this panel today about bridging the digital divide. We have Jean-Claude Brizard, yes. I want to say it properly, President and CEO of Digital Promise. Lauren Beliv, Head of Government Relations for Zoom. And Mike Katz, Executive Vice President for T-Mobile. So we're excited to get started. So I'm actually going to start by referencing Microsoft's Airband initiative. So our initiative is focused on digital equity and an effort to solve the challenges of the digital divide. And I know that all of your organizations are also working on this issue as well. Can you each elaborate on what your organization is doing to address the issues of affordability, access, and adoption?
Happy to start. So one of the foundational programs that we have at Digital Promise in partnership with Verizon is this thing called the Verizon Innovative Learning Schools Program. We are in nearly 600 schools in 32 states, working hand in glove with Verizon in underserved communities to provide access to hardware, access to the internet, and more importantly, the integration of the technology into the classrooms. So pedagogical practices, curriculum, et cetera.
Well, first, thank you so much. Lauren Beliv, I'm so pleased to be here. And I just wanted to make sure I wasn't on mute. Zoom joke, I'm sorry. Well, it's absolutely breathtaking what sort of year and a half that we've had. In any given day at Zoom on December 2019, we had about 10 million daily active users. And by April 1st, 2020, we had 300 million daily active users. And it was such a growth and scalability. And everyone here has been living and breathing it. And it has been absolutely humbling, especially what we've been doing around education. On March 6, 2020, we made a decision to offer our paid program for K through 12 schools. We were able to provide that for 125,000 schools in 25 countries, and it totals 95 billion minutes total that we've seen schools be able to utilize our program. And we were working hand in hand with teachers in order to try to make this better across the board. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today and diving into some of the topics.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here so much. And I'm going to pretend like I never heard Verizon being spoken at this. At T-Mobile, our flagship program for really going after and solving the digital divide is a program called Project 10 Million. And Project 10 Million is a program that we announced in November of 2019, recognizing that pre-pandemic, there was a big digital divide in this country. And there were millions and millions of kids that could not fully participate in school because by virtue of not having broadband, they couldn't be an equal to their classmates that did. So much of school in a fully physical environment now happens online. It happens before school, it happens after school, correspondence with teachers, turning in homework. Those things happen online. And with education being the great equalizer, not having broadband access was putting millions of kids at a disadvantage. And so we announced a program called Project 10 Million, which was our mission to permanently end the homework gap. A $10.7 billion 10-year commitment to give every student in America that needed a reliable broadband connection and equipment to access the internet that for free. The program started with a commitment to give students and families 100 gigabits of data, which we saw through lots of work that we'd done pre-announcement was more than 3 times as much data that a student would need for before and after schoolwork. Of course, then COVID happened and it changed. It shifted from a homework gap, a problem before and after school, to school being 100% online and fully virtual. So we worked with over 3,000 school districts to modify the program, offer more options, including fully unlimited options that enabled students to do schoolwork all day through platforms like Zoom. So to date, we're really proud that over 3 million kids over the course of this last year were connected, were able to fully participate in school because of T-Mobile broadband.
Thank you. Jean-Claude, I wanted to talk a little bit about digital promise. I know that you all are focused on the digital divide, but beyond that, you're also focused on research and also educational practices. One thing we know is that during the pandemic, about 3 million students were considered unaccounted for in school. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of having those students be unaccounted for, as well as the digital learning and homework gap and the impact of the pandemic on it?
Absolutely. Let me perhaps take a step back and talk a little bit about the problem before pandemic. We had about 16 million K-12 kids who didn't have access to good technology or broadband. And I think plus about 3 or 4 million post-secondary students. We often talk about K-12 kids, but really was a P16, K16 sort of issue. We made massive progress because of the pandemic, because programs like T-Mobile, Verizon, and others frankly stepped up, and school districts themselves purchased a ton of technology to give access to kids. In fact, I think in some cases, we went from 60% to 84% of kids getting access to hardware and to a computer and or to broadband. I think the bigger issue now, which New America published a few weeks ago, is the under access that kids now have to technology and broadband. For example, things like the data plan may not be sufficient. So they may be on Zoom for 2 hours and then all of a sudden it goes dark. Or you may have 3 or 4 children in a housing project sharing access to broadband, so it's insufficient to do what they need to do. So we talk about 3 things in closing the divide, and it really includes access, participation, and what we call powerful use. So the access and participation we are solving. The powerful use we also have to solve. One thing I would love perhaps for us to think about is that closing the divide is not just about hardware and access to the internet. It really has to involve the kind of integration of work into the classroom. You've heard about the homework gap. I like to separate the 2 words, the homework gap, because it's not just about before and after school. You think about the fact that more than 50% of a child's life is spent outside of school. You think about the access to everywhere learning, to ubiquitous learning has to be a part of the effort. I have 3 young boys and a daughter in college, and I can tell you, if they didn't have access to powerful technologies, they could not really have access to school before, during, and after school. That needs to be solved. The 3 million kids who we can't find, you wonder why. Is it because they can't log on? They don't have access? Some of these kids, by the way, have access to dial-up in this day and age, or they have a cell phone that they actually are using. Or is it perhaps the pedagogical practice was not engaging? I know my 5-year-old last spring would not get on Zoom, refused to do it. My daughter, thank God, was sent home from college, so she became his teacher. So you think about how many of those kids actually could not or were not engaged. Or perhaps if they were older, their parents had to go to work because they were essential workers, and the high school student became a caretaker. So all these issues, I think, will begin to come out maybe when school goes back into session for us to really understand what needs to be done. But more importantly, when you think about the kinds of powerful lessons, pedagogical practice, like the use of VR technology, for example, which is something we do quite a bit of at Digital Promise. If you don't have access to sufficient broadband, that kind of learning is not going to happen for you. You think about bringing the world to the classroom or to the home with really good access to video. It is not going to happen without sufficient data, sufficient broadband. So it is a really complex issue that I think BCG, BCG talked about to solve the problem, we need $7 billion to initially solve the problem, but then you need a recurring investment year over year to keep those things fresh. And that's perhaps where the state and the state chiefs can come in to support that kind of ongoing effort.
Thank you. I have a question for everyone. Really, what do you believe are the unaccounted costs of the digital divide if we don't address that problem with urgency? And what are some of the strategies that we as a country and as corporations should be executing to really help address this problem?
I'd love to start. I think you hit on such an important issue, which is access. And I think it's access to broadband. It's also access to technology and the use of technology. When you're communicating, you communicate with your voice, your body language, your expression. And one of the big pieces of Zoom is it makes you feel like you're actually in a room with other people and you feel like that technology falls away. Last summer, July of 2020, we hosted an academic academy where tens of thousands of teachers were able to participate along with administrators and school staff. And we had 2 days of learnings where we could figure out how do we combat Zoom fatigue? How do we have kids be more engaged? What sort of support mechanisms do teachers need? And simple features like the raise your hand feature came out of this academy. We're doing a second one. It was announced for July 28th, so next week. And that's all going to be focused on the future of a hybrid education. Now that people want to go back into the in-person schooling, some of the benefits that you've seen from a hybrid learning environment and the access to that, I think will be really interesting to plug in and see how can that be supported so you can learn from anywhere. You can be supported during a snowstorm in Chicago, or you can still have access to your school. But I think the first, and Jean-Claude, you hit the nail on the head. It's broadband access and ensuring that people have the bandwidth and the ability to have access to the technology.
Can I just do a quick follow-on? Because
Please
to continue the access theme, I think what's critically important is there has to be competition. And if you look at one of the things that I think is manifested or been a underlying part of this problem is more than 50% of Americans only have one or fewer choices of high-speed broadband. It's a highly uncompetitive market that results in many people not having access and those that have access paying a lot more than they should. And oftentimes we talk about this in the rural context, and certainly rural is disproportionately impacted, but it's happening also in our big urban centers. There needs to be more competition. We need to demand that there's more competition because all consumers will benefit, but particularly the people that struggle the most with getting access.
Just one two layers to that. One, the ideas of a public-private partnership has to be a big part of what we talk about. I mean, you hear it in T-Mobile, you hear it in Verizon, you hear it in Zoom, and there are others frankly working on this. So when you put together federal government, state government, and local school districts together with the kinds of private partnerships, you can actually begin to really close this. We saw it last year in the necessity of this kind of effort. But let me give you one nugget of an example of how we can begin to think about this. Most states have a textbook law. New York State has one. It's called NISTL. I was a school superintendent. We're given an allocation every single year to buy textbooks. Why can't that be also be made available to school superintendents around technology, software, broadband, et cetera? So the laws exist. I believe the dollars exist. I mean, the FCC, I think, has done a pretty good job of pushing this conversation forward. So but collectively, I think we can solve this problem. But again, foundationally, the folks who run schools can be the epicenter of this effort. But they have to understand this is not a one-time thing. It is an ongoing effort that has to be fully integrated in the pedagogical practices of schools.
So Lauren, my next question you kind of touched on already, which is like, what are some of the tools that we can provide to schools, educators, and students to really be able to use technology? Because one of the issues is that there's lack of digital skilling, lack of workforce training. How can we help them to use the technology in the classroom better?
There's a number of tools, both tangible and intangible, but I think the first is partnership. Zoom has done a lot to raise money and to have grant money to go toward the right partners like Education Superhighway, Bridging the Digital Divide, and ensuring that there's enough grants and resources for schools to have the tools. The second is actually access. And access, for us, we're a software company, but ensuring that people have the right hardware to be able to access. You said some kids are on cell phones, some kids are on laptops and desktops, and it's a hybrid. How can schools have the right funding to be able to supply with students with the tools that they need? And then again, I think the most intangible is broadband, and competition is a huge part to that, to ensure that there is a universal coverage for students to have access both in a rural, a suburban, an exurban, and a city environment. So.
Jean-Claude?
Just one more layer to this. And we were just talking earlier with the governor of Arkansas, the idea of workforce development. Let me give you an example of how powerful technology can change the dynamic of so much of what we do in schools. We talk about pedagogy, we talk about math curriculum, science, et cetera. But think about this. The transition from high school to post-secondary in America is a cliff for a lot of young people. And because I have a 5-year-old and a 20-year-old, I live P16. I just put my daughter through college about 2 years ago. She walked into Loyola University. As an educated, knowledgeable person, it was hell navigating that process. There's a program in Dallas called the Green Light Project that leverages blockchain technology that puts the power and the agency in the hands of students and families to navigate not just higher ed, but the workforce ecosystem, all leveraging technology to do that kind of work. So that kind of example of how a tool or technology can solve a long-standing issue in education are the ways in which you can see the world change. And the lead is the Dallas Promise, a scholarship program, but it wasn't just about getting money for kids to go to college, but helping them getting access to the scholarship. Brilliant work done by the Commit Partnership in Dallas.
Mike, this question is for you. So I know that you would agree with me that connectivity and access to connectivity is one of the key components of bridging this digital divide. Can you speak about your Project 10 Million and talk about how T-Mobile went about implementing that program for both urban and rural students in need?
Yeah, like I said, we developed and announced Project 10 Million before the pandemic. And we announced it as part of the first initiative that we would do when we successfully completed our merger with Sprint, which coincidentally then happened after the pandemic. So when the merger closed, like I mentioned in the open, we had to quickly pivot the program because we realized that we were solving a different problem. We weren't just solving homework gap, we were solving the schoolwork gap, full connectivity needed all day. Our team then went to work, and we went to work working closely in, like Jean-Claude said, in public-private partnerships. And those happened mostly directly with school districts and with states. And we had the opportunity to partner with thousands of school districts across the country, almost every state in the country as well as with other private sector companies, particularly in the hardware and software space. And every single one of them was a different situation. We found, many schools had some equipment. They might have some equipment that only could access Wi-Fi networks, and so we had to work to provide portable hotspots. We had some school districts like New York City where their students had nothing. They had no devices. They had no access to internet, and we had to do a big partnership that was between us, the city, and Apple to provide iPads. So every situation was a little bit different. We tried to work with at every single level of both state government and school districts, so we could assess, understand, and then bring the right collaboration, right parties to actually collaborate. Training was a big part of it, and like we were just talking about, and the training was important not only in the classroom environment. And what we found, the classroom environments, most of the teachers, because they were used to dealing with some level of devices and had broadband in the classroom, the learning curve wasn't that steep. Where we really found the training was the most valuable was for the individual students themselves. So that not only did they have broadband, but they knew how to use the broadband and use their devices. And one huge tertiary benefit that we saw, and I think we're going to look back on COVID and really recognize that it was a catalyst to do a major closing of the digital divide, is because these devices that were deployed and intended for education began to be used for many other things. A couple of the really common uses we saw were telehealth. At the same time schools were shut down, a lot of clinics were shut down, and families that didn't have internet literally couldn't get healthcare. And so these devices began to be used for telehealth. Job searches, families that were unemployed or went out of work because of COVID were able to quickly enter themselves back into the job market by using these devices. So education was important, so the whole family could understand how to take advantage of the connectivity in their household, both to facilitate education, but to facilitate a lifeline for their entire family. So, a lot of the points have been made. Public-private partnership, really important. Partnership across private sector companies, and a willingness and understanding that these devices can't be single use. They can't just be for education. They need to be a platform that the family can use for all of their connectivity needs.
Can you speak a little bit more about what T-Mobile did to actually work with those individual school districts and states and the local government to initiate your project?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a really specific examples. New York City. So New York City called us 3 or 4 days before they were going to announce that schools were shutting down. So I remember the day in my head. It was a Saturday. I believe it was like March 19th. They called us. They said on Monday they were going to announce schools were going to shut down. And New York City, the biggest city in this country, the most affluent country in the world, had almost 500,000 kids that didn't have broadband access. So they knew when schools shut down that they had a major, major problem, that almost half their students were not going to be able to participate in school. So we quickly worked with their technology teams. We brought in several other partners, both hardware partners. Apple was a big partner with us. We brought in a couple software partners, and we literally sat with them inside the DOE facilities, taking SIM cards, sticking them into iPads, programming them with the software that the school districts use, and then worked with them on a deployment process. And the deployment process was, in some cases, going door to door to hand devices out, do a quick training, and or provide them with a website and a phone number that they could use with any questions, or for tutorials, or for virtual help. So we had to set up most of our help virtually with the school districts, obviously, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, which was done mostly through call centers and mostly through video tutorials.
So you did a lot of hand-holding. What does success look like for your program?
For me, it's a great question. For me, success with this program is that it's not a flash in the pan. That we don't look back on this year and say, hey, for this year and a half, we were dealing with COVID and schools were either fully or partially shut down. We got connectivity, and then the connectivity goes away, and then we're right back where we were pre-pandemic. To me, success looks like the federal government, state governments, school districts prioritizing connectivity as a mandatory need for all of their students. In my opinion, broadband for students is as important as electricity is in their house, as heat is in their house. It's a mandatory thing for students to be successful and to have an equal opportunity with all of their student counterparts that have broadband. So for me, long-term commitments to this, so that we don't take a step back after the pandemic.
And do you see any additional investments into education in the community from T-Mobile?
Yeah, like I said, Project 10 million for us is a minimum 10-year commitment, $10.7 billion, and and connecting 10 million kids. And that 10 million was our forecast on how many students would be unconnected over the next 10 years. We want to make sure that every kid that needs a connection has one. So we're committed to this for the long term. We want to make sure every student has this opportunity. And I will say, one of the things that I am proud of is I do think our program has inspired others to make the same commitment. So for me, success is that T-Mobile doesn't just own this program alone, but our counterparts that compete in this space as well do the same. And I've seen them do a lot of it.
Awesome. Lauren, it's been an amazing year for Zoom, right? You've gone from like a niche product to ubiquitous. In fact, most people call their calls Zoom calls and Zoom meetings. What's next for Zoom as people go back to the classroom and go back out into the world? What do you see on the horizon for Zoom as far as education, and more specifically K through 12 versus higher learning? How do you think Zoom is going to play into that?
Well, I think that is the question, right? And it's a really exciting one, where the Zoom of 2019 is not the Zoom that we are today. And the opportunities really are endless, because as hard as the pandemic was, the idea of having frictionless communication has been such a benefit, and people are now having access in ways that they have never dreamed about before. And the ability to communicate with people across different time zones and locations, there's a real equity that's been built in that didn't exist before, or there were barriers to entry before. And with Zoom, the feeling that the reason it is the Q-tip of the industry in some ways is because there was a seamlessness for consumers to be able to engage with it immediately. And that, I think, is opening up possibilities. In terms of education, I think we're at ground zero to know that we're uniquely positioned to be a benefit for the return to in-person school? How do we now support and allow for teachers to have more collaborative environments? I think K through 12 is a little bit of a different position than higher education, where if you want to be taking a class at Loyola, but living in Washington, D.C., you can now do that and have remote access. If you're a teacher, you can now teach from anywhere. And I think you're opening up the world in different ways and allowing for different partnerships. For K through 12, it really is about supporting the students and the teachers and the school systems and ensuring that they have access to the technology that they need. And that's going to be, as I mentioned, we have the academies that are going on. It's a learning process, and the more that we can support schools going forward, that is core to the mission and to everything that we do.
One of the things that I think happened during pandemic is that folks had to you were working and then you also had your children, you're trying to educate them. And so there became this clear nexus between work and education and business and education. But prior to that, really the lines between education and business were tenuous. What do you think are some of the things that businesses can do better to bridge that gap with the education system?
Happy to jump on this one first. So one, the idea of flexibility, I think now is an expectation. I know in my organization, everyone's expected to have flexibility because parents have had a view into the classroom I'm hoping they never let go of. And it goes back to what you were saying before that, in the New America report talked about this, that when you give a child access to full technology, the parents and the family benefits. So if you have a job in making sure that one, you can continue to see what your child is doing, support your children what they're doing, I think is going to be critical. For businesses to really understand that is going to be critical. I know my wife's company, for example, they would not allow folks to work remotely before. Now it's going to become part of the infrastructure of the organization. So hybrid, I think, is the goal of the future. Maybe asynchronous learning becomes also part of the landscape as well too.
I fully agree, and it's something where the private public partnerships will go a very long way. I keep thinking about, I don't know if this was a few months ago, but there was a photo that went viral of two girls sitting in a fast food parking lot with the Taco Bell parking lot trying to get the Wi-Fi from the restaurant in order to do their homework. And there needs to be just a lot more there to be able to support students for having the tools that they need and the access they need. I think from a company perspective, the more that we can support schools as we were giving K through 12 free unlimited, our product free and unlimited, the more we can help teachers be able to do the work that they need to do. And that's just something that it shouldn't just be because of the pandemic. It needs to be an evergreen process.
Yeah, I think Jean-Claude said it really well, that a hybrid work model, I think, provides both flexibility for the family and flexibility for the employer. And I think this last year taught us that we can still be pretty productive in this environment. There's lots of things that were hard about it. I know my 4-year-old son made lots of cameo appearances in my Zoom calls, sometimes without clothes on. So that was really interesting. But I think it taught us that we can work in this environment and that there's real benefits both for both parties. The fact that we've got technology now that can, if we make it accessible, offer ubiquity of connectivity really no matter where you are. The fact that we have software programs that allow you to have a work environment pretty much wherever you are, I think is important both for the family dynamic, but also important for the modern way we work. Like we're becoming more and more of a global economy. There's people that you work with that are in different physical locations. And in 2021, if we can't find a way to work productively in that environment, I think that's going to be one of the things that holds companies back.
So how can the access to broadband adoption make intergenerational changes in a family that would impact their healthcare, their education, their job opportunities? How do you see that playing out? Because maybe that's really the call for our government leaders to invest more, not just to have the private sector do it, but also have, and we've seen that, right, through CARES Act and American Recovery Act, more opportunities to help spur connectivity. But can you talk about the impact that you think this has intergenerationally on families?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, simply put, education is the great leveler. It is the great leveler, and you cannot fully participate in education without a broadband connection. You are at a disadvantage, and the likelihood that you get left behind increases, I think, substantially. And so I think from the start, if you cannot equally participate in education, you don't have a chance to become more successful or successful as your peers that have it, and create things like generational wealth. So to me, it really starts there. It starts with having equal access to education, regardless of your economic situation shouldn't determine your ability to participate in school. It never should, and we should demand that as a country, that we never let that happen.
I can't agree more. And you mentioned the CARES Act. There's a lot of initiatives through the CARES Act that were so wonderful and opened the door for technologies like telehealth and education support that are set to sunset at the end of the public health emergency. But this is something too to consider as Congress is considering some of these major initiatives of what's really working for society due to the pandemic, and to have access to healthcare via telehealth and have better support systems for teachers. That's something I think as a policymaker, they should really consider what is something to continue moving forward.
And just add very quickly, goes back again to this report I've been mentioning, that when you give a child or student access to that kind of technology, the parents benefit, the whole family benefits from having access to this window in the world. Someone may be looking for a job, could be telehealth, could be, what are you doing right now on your computer? Can I see what you're doing in mathematics? Or the entire family actually benefits from that one access point.
I want to focus on something positive, which I would like to call, so I'm going to refer to as silver linings of the pandemic. But like I always try to teach my kids, we want to make lemonade from the lemons. Let's not just focus on the lemons. And so I think that one of the things that we did during this pandemic is we've learned a lot of new skills and a lot of things that we haven't done before. Can you elaborate on some of the learnings that you think that we've made through the pandemic?
Absolutely. So one, we are going to be launching a series of storytelling about great innovations that happened in the past year for the Department of Education. So stay tuned. My colleague is in the audience here. We're working with us in the very same project. So stay tuned for that. We published an article a few weeks ago that looked at students who actually thrived last year. These were kids who had special needs, who had ADHD, you name it, for some reason thrive. The question is why and how. So what can we extract from that to teach the system on how to better individualize instruction for students? So this is the typical access to more courses across the world, across the country, but we saw individual students, including kids of color, who thrive in this environment. The question is, so why and what can we learn from that? You'll be hearing much more from us in the next few weeks.
I would just add on to it. People think about moving forward in the new normal. I sometimes like to take a retro view and think, what would have happened over the last year and a half if there wasn't video communications and the accelerated technologies that we had? How many jobs would have been lost? What kind of contractions would we have seen in the GDP? What would America's schools look like if there wasn't any sorts of technologies to support it? And I think that's a huge learning, to take the kind of the scenarios of what would happen, what if, and to move that going forward too, to see, okay, as we're moving forward, we have these technologies in place. They're not just pandemic technologies. This could be a really great hybrid workforce. And how can we take that to the next level to ensure that there is an increase in job opportunities and there is an increase for schools and teachers and access. So it's an interesting moment of reflection, I think, as we're entering, hopefully, knock on wood, out of this situation. But it's something just to think about as we're moving forward.
Yeah, really well said. I think kind of first and foremost at the macro level, I think we learned that we can have as a people empathy for each other. I was mentioning to you guys before this that this is the first time and hopefully the only time in our lives that we all are simultaneously going through the exact same thing. And the challenges that each of us face, like we all have our own version of those. And so I just saw this incredible empathy across the world as everybody recognized that we were going through the same thing, and you could understand my challenges and I could understand yours, which I think is a beautiful thing that I hope that we maintain. I also think that as we're getting closer to the light at the tunnel, we also recognize the importance I think have seen some of the benefits of being able to extend the way we work or the way we do school through virtual means. But also as we get closer and we start seeing people in 3 dimensions again and stuff, we also recognize the importance of physical presence too. And that the two can work together, and that maybe there's a 1 + 1 = 3 kind of environment that we can create if we've got the right connectivity and the right tool sets. So I'm hoping that as we come out of this, that we take the best of both worlds, the pre-pandemic and the during pandemic, and we get that multiplier effect.
I love that you said that. I love how you said that 1 + 1 = 3. I love that. Jean-Claude?
I think that was great. I don't think there's much more to add to that.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming to the panel. I want to thank you all. I thought this was a great conversation. I think there needs to be more conversations around this. I know that all of our organizations are working on the digital divide, and it's near and dear to our hearts, but it's also important for America. And so I want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you.